So let's see how you did with the 3 questions I asked about the poem. Who does the pronoun she refer to? What is the first metaphor introduced into the poem? And what other literary techniques do you see in the poem? Well, the first metaphor I wanted you to see, I've put in red on the screen here, and it's the idea that she is a tiger. Literal tiger, probably not. It's a metaphorical tiger. There's a comparison being made between the she and how she treats the speaker of the poem. That is a comparison that doesn't necessarily use words like or as. Which leads me to a second technique you can see here in the poem. I've put into highlighted blue 4 connecting words that mark what we call similes. Like a metaphor, a simile is a comparison, but the difference is that the simile includes a word such as like or as. And here you can see there are 4 different similes right off the bat, probably more if you dig more deeply. Another literary technique or device that I see here is the touch of time's unerring hand is a classic example of personification. You take a concept or an unnatural force and you give it human characteristics. And time is one of the great examples of something that's been personified in literature all the way back to the earliest poems we have, and most famously in Shakespeare, and then throughout American poetry. So personifying time is a classic sort of trope, a pattern, a common thing that happens in American poetry. Another thing I see in this poem a lot of, at least to me, is imagery, right? The teeth sinking into the throat is a visceral, visual image. The strength standing erect against her hate. There's almost a phallic image there. The sweeping of a flood, the walls of a kingdom, the dark gazing into the days ahead, and granite wonders, right? Lots of visual imagery in the poem, even the last line, right? Priceless treasures sinking in the sand. So we see metaphor, we see simile, we see personification, and we see imagery all over this poem. Now, obviously, when you read a poem, you are given the title, and most poems have titles, and the answer to my first question will become obvious when you see the title of this poem. But I'm also going to present to you at the same time as the title, the year the poem was written. And the year the poem was written gets us into the important question of context. So let's see what we have here. America is the name of the poem, written in 1922. Now we know who the tiger is, America. And we know, too, that in terms of 1922, we're talking about the period in American culture after World War I, before the Great Depression. And we want to explore maybe a bit more about what that tells us about that the poem, what it can teach us about the poem and the meaning of the poem. Let's see if we can learn something about the poet. This is his picture. He's Claude McKay. He was a Jamaican African-American who was a early figure in the Harlem Renaissance. Some see him as a prefigure, some see him as a central figure. A lot of debate about Claude McKay and his role in the culture. But clearly, this is a Harlem Renaissance voice writing between World War I and the Great Depression. We're talking about an African American's experience of America as a tiger. And suddenly the metaphor when contextualized seems quite rich. Let's think a little bit about the language of our course outcome that asks us to discuss how a literary device creates meaning. In other words, a literary device is something that takes us beyond the literal meanings of words. It gets us into a figurative meaning. It plays with associations, and a word we're going to frequently use for associations, connotations. Now, the first literary device that we used here that we used here, that we discussed here, was metaphor. And there's a definition that I have paraphrased from the poetryfoundation.org's website. A comparison, direct or indirect, that doesn't use works such as like or as to point out similarities. A simile does use those words. And a famous one that I was reminded of when I looked at the definition on the Poetry Foundation site is Emily Dickinson's metaphor about hope, right? Where she basically compares hope to a bird. And the question is, how does something like hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul, how does comparing hope to a bird help us understand what hope is? Help us how does the metaphor create meaning about hope and meaning for a reader who's trying to understand hope? Well, the idea is that I come to a richer sense of the meaning. Meaning is created by metaphor through association. So when I start making associations with birds, I might think about them as signs of freedom. I might think of them as creatures who can fly and therefore associate them psychologically with transcendence or escape or freedom. Or I might see birds as vulnerable, as frail, as subjects of human prey and destruction. Based on the move I make there, whether I see the bird as liberatory and transcendent, or whether I see the bird as fragile and endangered, or perhaps both, I generate all sorts of possible meanings about the relationship between hope and the soul, right? So that's how metaphors work to create meaning. Another way to think about metaphor is to break down its component pieces. So if we think about McKay's metaphor of America as a tiger, there's some formal terminology we can use here to help us. In this metaphor, the thing we're trying to understand, America, could be called the tenor. And the thing that's being used to help us better understand the tenor is referred to as the vehicle. And so we can ask ourselves, how is America like a tiger for a black man in the 1920s? And clearly, the emphasis here is on the danger, right? The tooth sinking into the throat, and the image of being swept up in sort of overwhelming power. And we can get that just by thinking about tigers and looking at the imagery of power and resistance that's discussed throughout the poem. But if we want to get beyond looking at the language in isolation within the structure of the poem itself, which tells us a lot, we're going to need to make another move. We're going to need to move beyond just the language and see if we can connect the language to culture. And that will have to wait for the next video lecture.